In today's video, I'm going to be completing the Brazil migration case study, and in this video we're going to be looking at impacts of migration. This is for the OCR A-level geography spec, and this is the impact that migration has had on the economic development, political stability and social equality or inequality in Brazil. So in terms of economic development, the one thing that we can see that has happened positively in Brazil is that we have had lots of migrant remittances. So people that have gone to the USA and Japan and Portugal have made money, and then they've sent that money back to their families, and that has had a really positive impact on a local scale. So the example I've used here is of Brazilians that have gone to the USA, and then they've done a study on what they actually use the remittances for when it was sent back to their families. So we can see that it can be used for education, it can be for covering housing and rent costs, daily expenditures on things like clothing and food. But if there is enough of it, it can also be used for business investments, it can be used for creating new businesses. All of this money being put back into the local economy can lead to the multiplier effect, which is where when there is more disposable income, that gets used on goods and services, which causes those local businesses to grow, leading to more kind of a virtuous cycle. So migrant remittances can have a really, really positive impact on the local economy. In terms of what this would impact nationally, it's 2.4 billion gets sent back in remittances to Brazil. Even though that's not the hugest amount of the GDP, it's still significant in terms of the impact that would have locally. So we also can talk about how during the different waves of immigration to Brazil, and I've given examples here where we've had a wave of immigration from Europe and Japan in the 19th century, but also the more recent Haitian migration since 2010. These can have really positive impact on the economy because they can help key sectors. So we can have lots of labour come in, and that happened when the Europeans came in the 19th century and started helping with coffee cultivation, and the Haitians now are having really important impact on agriculture and manufacturing. So because of these different stages of immigration that have happened over many years, we can see that there's been really, really positive growth in really key sectors, and those are particularly agriculture and manufacturing. The other thing to consider in terms of economic development is because they've got these long connections with Japan, Portugal and USA, we often get high-skilled economic migrants coming from those countries to Brazil for new opportunities. They can therefore plug gaps in the labour market. For example, you might have a shortage in the healthcare, and therefore you get nurses and doctors and come into that area, which means that area is more productive and more effective. But also some of these people might bring new ideas. They bring innovations that they've learnt in their own country, and they can also bring money into the country. These two effects basically mean that the Brazilian economy grows and is more efficient, it's more productive, and also allows to a more diversification. You often get economic migrants coming over and starting businesses. You get entrepreneurs. That leads to more growth. So it's obviously a very positive impact in terms of Brazil's economic development. I'm now going to consider political stability, and the area I want to focus on first of all is the migration and Mercosur, which is the trade bloc that Brazil is part of. The blue countries in the picture on the right are the Mercosur countries. It's a trade bloc like the EU, which means that there is free trade, but there's also freedom of movement. So if you're a Brazilian and you want to go and live and work in Argentina, then you can move there without having to get a visa, and you can stay and be employed in that state as well. And the same can happen for Argentina and Brazil. So because Brazil is part of Mercosur, it's had a significant amount of movement and people coming to Brazil and Brazilians going to other countries. And this has led to political stability. The reason why is because we've got those regular flows of people and trade and money. These governments have to cooperate to make sure that it happens stably and without conflict, and therefore it creates a kind of unity politically within South America between these countries. So it creates this stable environment, because any conflict would mean that those businesses wouldn't get the labour migration that they would need, businesses would start to falter, and so it benefits these countries to get on, and therefore it makes that labour migration really, really easy. Also, we talked about the fact that there's well-established and really significant migrant flows between places like Brazil and Japan and Portugal and USA. That this means because people are going between these countries regularly, these governments again cooperate with each other, and that makes them very, very stable relationships. They've often led to political agreements between the two countries and collaborations. So the idea that people are moving between these countries has actually made these governments talk to each other better, make kind of agreements, make collaborations, and therefore the political stability is very, very strong between these specific countries and Brazil. One other area that kind of I'd like to consider is the way that Brazil deals with refugees. Because Brazil has started to grow as an economy and become more of a stable government, they've started to successfully receive and process refugees that have often come from environmental or political issues in other countries. One of those examples is there is big kind of political issues in Venezuela, and many people are turning up at the border trying to get into Brazil. And the Brazilian government has actually started a policy called Operation Welcome, where they're getting those people from the border from Venezuela and helping to relocate them to different parts of Brazil. To be able to do this, the Brazilian government needs to be pretty really stable, and therefore the fact that it can do this shows that it has a certain level of political development. So we can therefore see a link between migration issues and political stability within Brazil. The last thing I'm going to consider is social inequality. So we can see that there is significant migrant flows both within Brazil and internationally. And if I look at, for example, internal migration, lots of people coming from that poor northeast and ending up in the cities of the southeast, that can often lead to those people that are poorly educated and end up being poorly paid, kind of clustering in favelas. And so we get a spatial kind of difference in the fact is there can be lots of poor migrants living in certain areas of city like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, because they've moved in there, they haven't got the opportunities and therefore are forced into the worst accommodation. I talked about that internal migration from the northeast to the southeast, and obviously those people that are leaving the northeast are often people that are younger. Some of them are kind of more educated than people in their area, and therefore as they move, that creates a rural-urban divide. So what we get left in the rural area is the people that are very poorly educated and often older, and then the cities get the youngest and the more vibrant and educated people. So we get poverty actually being focused in not only in favelas in cities, but then in rural areas where all the people have left to migrate for opportunities. I talked about migration quite generally in terms of how it can create inequalities, but obviously not all groups experience it in the same way. There are winners and losers, and there are often a kind of an ethnic issue in terms of migration in Brazil, and the fact that African migrants often suffer more than any other kind of migrants. The reason why this is they've come to Brazil often for economic opportunities. Some of them might be political refugees, but they often get discrimination in the labour market. That means they are judged on their race and therefore do not have the same opportunities and access to jobs that native Brazilians are. This can lead to the fact that they often get paid significantly less than native Brazilians. And we should add all these factors together. This therefore forces them into kind of the worst housing. So they often end up in overcrowded favelas that are like run by gangs, and also they can be discriminated in the housing provision. So because of their ethnicity, that they might not be given the access to the best type of services or best type of houses. This is a historic issue in Brazil. Brazil was the last place in North America and South America to abolish slavery, and so there is a deep-rooted historic racism in Brazil, and so if you're an African migrant or if you're a black Brazilian, those are the people that are disproportionately affected by this. So we can see that not all migrants experience the positive effects of migration, and some will have much more inequality on them. The same is for the Haitian group. They often have suffered very similar inequalities, getting paid less, longer hours, working on these big industrial farms and working really, really long hours and not getting paid the same way. They get the limited access to services, and also, again, this historic racial discrimination from native Brazilians, which means that they suffer in terms of housing but also job opportunities. This has actually led to many of the Haitians who had come to Brazil escaping kind of issues in terms of humanitarian issues, and this caused them actually to move on to other countries in South America. So they've moved on to Chile, but some of those have again experienced the same kind of racial prejudice there and have actually moved on again through transit countries to try and make it to America to reach the established Haitian diaspora that is in the USA. So we can see that again there are winners and losers here, and often there is a very specific group in Brazil that suffers the impacts of migration and doesn't get all of the benefits that perhaps some of the other groups do.